Good afternoon, or good evening, good morning for some of you. I would like to welcome you all to our panel today to discuss urban complexities in a changing climate. And let me start by introducing myself. My name is Aynur Kadasanoğlu, and I work at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent as the Senior Urban Advisor. And I'm sure if you joined the sessions during this very interesting humanitarian congress, you heard a lot about the impacts of climate change, among other things. And just as with the ongoing pandemic, cities are hit hardest by the adverse impacts of climate change. And today, we have excellent panelists who will give us diverse perspectives from national policy level to city and community levels. And they will share with us with many innovative and impactful actions and ideas. So let me introduce our panelists today. We have Ms. Hindun Mulaika, who is the Climate and Energy Campaign Manager for Greenpeace Indonesia. She has been working in sustainable development and its impacts on landscape for a long time and has successfully led climate and sustainable energy campaigns in Indonesia. She'll be joining us from Indonesia, Jakarta today. And we'll also hear from Dr. Rebecca Price, who is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Industrial Design Engineering at Delft University of Technology. She works with public and private organizations to support the application of design upon complex innovative challenges. And we will have a little bit later Dr. Thomas Sainhassen, who currently serves as the Director for Humanitarian Assistance, and he has worked in some of the most challenging humanitarian settings in his career and later on policy and diplomacy side as well. We also have a video recording from Mrs. Elizabeth Zavala, Secretary General of the Philippine Red Cross. She won't be able to join us today physically, but you can find the link to the recording in the chat box. And I would strongly encourage you to watch it after our session for her inspirational talk. Again, before we start, I would like to remind you, please feel free to post your comments, questions in the chat box. You can see on the right side of your screen. And feel free to tweet as well using hashtag HCBerlin. Thanks again for joining us. Maybe we can start with you, Hindun. Can you tell us about how grassroots organizations and activists can influence the policy and legislations of national governments to ensure sustainable urban development while addressing the impact of climate change in urban setting and cities?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Ainur. Hi, I would like to say hi to everybody that are also joining us in these sessions. Thank you for joining our sessions as well. So, under the context of the grassroots movement that also we have done quite a massive campaigning in the last 10 years. I think dealing with the urban issue, we're dealing with a very complex issue, starting from the infrastructure, economic, social problems. And then if we revert to, for example, like Jakarta as one of the cities, of the mega cities that I've been working on, I think inequality issues is one thing that is actually emerged. And then there is a growing concentrations of the wealth group and where the urban poor have lived densely in a very populated area. And I think these situations makes even worse when the climate disaster came. So what we get is actually from that momentum, and then building from the crises that are happening in the cities, especially the crisis that getting most of the majorities of the urban Jakarta, like the crisis to a very bad air pollution that will strongly related to your health threat, and then another crisis of flooding that regularly, even yearly, happen as well in Jakarta. So I think building on that momentum and building awareness, like people is already get very much disappointed on that situation. So I think the importance is actually when we run a campaign is how do we actually try also to bring people and people aspirations. But I think on top of it, it is also very much important to build a very good understanding on knowledge on the cause of the crisis itself. So, for example, in our air pollution campaign, we are up to a level that even the Jakarta citizens are running citizen lawsuit to their governments. But it takes time to reach up to that level. And then it is quite a lot of educations and data that we bring forward. So it's not about the people that they just don't understand what happened, but it is just about the information is just not yet there under their knowledge. But when they do understand about the threat and whatever the cause of this polluted sectors that are very much implicate the crisis, there actually will be very easy to move forward together with us to put a pressure point to the governments. And we have quite a lot of examples on the starting with the reform of the emissions regulations, strengthening the emission standard of coal-fired power plants, and also emissions on the transportation sector and spatial planning due to the recent floodings in Jakarta. So I think, yeah, that's quite a brief from the work that we have done.
Excellent. I mean, definitely Jakarta is not alone in do you mind muting yourself? Jakarta is definitely not alone in experiencing more frequent floodings, city floodings, and also air pollution is becoming a really, really important problem. And I really like that you are focusing on the motivation and aspiration of people to drive this kind of change. This is a really excellent point. Thank you so much. And Rebecca, turning to you, I mean, speaking of local action on the ground and inspiring aspirations of people, we are also witnessing youth increasingly calling for immediate action all over the world to do something about this immediate crisis. Can you tell us how we can harness the creative energy and commitment of the next generation to develop solutions for vulnerable urban dwellers?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Indeed, we have young and optimistic and hopeful young people who are speaking out in increasing numbers, and I think we unfairly tarnish them as naive. In fact, they have not felt the burden of the bureaucracies that maybe we are familiar with from the inside. What they see is an injustice, and they respond to that. Now, to really benefit from young people, we need to have we need to give them agency. And to give them agency, we need a framework in which we can convert their concerns into an opportunity to work with them to actually develop solutions. We at the university, of course, have a very strong institutional framework that is the tertiary education sector. But what we can do is use the tertiary education sector in a creative way to engage young people. By that, I mean we have researchers, we have partnering organizations, and we bring in the students to work on real world problems. And we give them the agency to develop ideas and pitch them directly to the top bosses, the directors, the executives of the organizations that they work for. Now, I can give you an example. At TU Delft, we've been working with the Netherlands Red Cross through the Faculty of Industrial Design Engineering, and we've been looking at how we can drive humanitarian innovation through design. By that, I mean we are looking to understand why people are vulnerable. Of course, it's all well and good to say, okay, the elderly, the people with existing health conditions and low socioeconomic demographic will be more vulnerable during an urban heat wave, for example, but we need to know why that is. What are the underlying mechanisms? And so we task our students with doing this. And we do what I like to call, we give them a license to be radical. That means we ask them explicitly to challenge conventions that we have and that are well established. And at the end of their projects, we put them on the stage, if you like, and we ask them to pitch their ideas, their design ideas, solutions, again, to the top of organizations. And that's when we give them the final bit of agency. Now, if all goes to plan, those ideas are actually implemented. And then we go again, because as you know, or you might know, innovation is continuous activity. So this is how we can engage young people. Of course, I understand I'm speaking from a privileged point of view. Not everybody has access to university education, but of course, any educational framework, as long as it involves students, educators, and then a third party, which is that humanitarian organization or public sector organization, as providing a problem to work on, that's where we can really help young people to transfer their concerns into ideas and solutions.
Thank you so much. Really interesting. I really like that you combine research, evidence-based, with the youth being agents and finding solutions. I think that also tells a lot to us as humanitarian organizations, that we need to communicate very well the underlying reasons and put the evidence out there before asking people to take action. That speaks to us very well. Thank you very much. And I see Thomas joining us right now. Thomas, can you hear us? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Apologies.
Welcome. No problem.
Without an assistant. My deep apologies.
No problem. Well, welcome to the panel. And so from local level action, we are now going up to the national government level. So maybe I can ask you, what do you think can governments learn from the innovative and inspiring actions on the ground and in universities to inform your policy decisions and action? How do we make sure that there is a learning loop, a feedback loop is happening, and the communities, the youth, is not just receiving end of the government policies, but they are actually contributing? Can you tell us a little bit, and also add a little bit about your perspective as the German government? Thank you.
So, sorry, I know, was that addressed to me?
Yes, please. The floor is yours.
Okay. Sorry, I'm a bit at loss because I had to change between various computers. I just on my iPad, and I'm still trying to get my act together. So the question was, what can we learn from academia? Yeah. Okay. I think we can learn quite a lot from academia, but to be very honest, I think humanitarian practitioners can even learn more from academia. And I'm talking about academia, let's say the exchange in a very broad sense of analysis and research and technology and digitalization and engineering. I think everything, in short, that helps us to deepen a bit the understanding of a crisis, the nature of a crisis, but also anything that fosters innovation and progress in the humanitarian operational system. For this reason, about 5 years ago, together with World Food Program, we created in Munich the Wsp Innovation Accelerator. And that's precisely the idea, to create a platform where academia can meet practitioners from the field, and that we can explore new ideas and set up promising pilots. And ultimately, if these pilots are not only promising but working, that we can scale them up and introduce them into the operational system. And I think quite a lot has been done in that field, and we have some things emerging from that cooperation. Just one example would be the introduction of blockchain technology in creating safe, multi-purpose cash cards for refugees in urban contexts like Amman in Jordan. Another example, a bit different, but hydroponic systems. I mean, it's the idea that people can grow their own food and fodder in the most remote places on the planet. I mean, we can do that in Chad, in the desert, or in Algeria with Sahrawi refugees, and we can do it in urban slums like Lima. Mm-hmm. The second point, I think, where we do think that if we listen to academia, we can change a lot is, I think that is particularly dear to our ministry, which is anticipatory humanitarian financing. And the Red Cross has been our key partner here. And so what we have been setting up is an idea that, let's take the example of Bangladesh, for instance, where they're constantly tormented by floods and storms. And the idea is using existing scientific data, which is out there on meteorological data, and turn them into an early warning system. It's a kind of alert system. And once the alert system identifies the high likelihood of a tornado, or a hurricane, to hit a certain part of the Ganges Delta, for instance, it would trigger predefined operations that we have been setting in place with our partners on the ground, and we would free immediately money to do the necessary interventions, say 48 hours before actually there was landfall of the hurricane. So they would start evacuating people from the affected areas, give them money to transport their livelihood, their family and their belongings to safe places, get ready with shelter building, etc. We can also do that for heat waves. We do that in urban contexts in Hanoi, or we can do it for droughts in Somalia. So, and this is really winning traction. I think with climate change, this will become much more important because the amount of natural disasters and the impact will grow bigger with time. And what we learned so far is really out of $1 we spend on this kind of anticipatory financing, we save $8 if we had reacted after, say, landfall. So it's not only very good for people because it's dignified, it saves lives, but it's also very cost effective. And I think that's something where truly would not have been there without the impulse that came from academia. It was them that pushed the idea and pushed us and the Red Cross to do what is necessary. Well.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And really, nobody should suffer from predictable disasters. We know that it's coming. We have all the means and technology to predict the impact, the likelihood of all these, especially weather-related events. And this kind of anticipatory action is really getting hold of, really strong in our network, Red Crescent network as well. And I'm very happy to see the government support increasing in that matter. Before, again, turning back to our panelists, I would like to remind you, the audience, please add post your questions, comments in the chat box next to your screen, on the right side of your screen. And also for the Twitter fans, please use the hashtag HCBerlin. With that, I would like to go back to you, Rebecca, again, and ask you, with all these interesting things happening with your students, very innovative, creative things, but how can we bridge this kind of research, knowledge, all the innovation with communities and make the results more accessible and useful for the community leaders to take action?
Yes, thank you for the question. A nice question and a rhetorical challenge for scientific organizations to see the value of their breakthroughs in society. I'm just going to touch on that for a second because it's quite a fundamental issue. So I like to think of the balance or the synchrony between science and society as a bit of a dance, right? It's a back and forth in which we try to understand the full and powerful potential of a particular technology and the rationality of that potential. And we also look to our society and we look at the complex problems. We look at the messiness. We look at the kind of, again, that bureaucratic power play that's happening and maybe the irrationality of the system. So we're mixing, really a pure technological breakthrough, trying to put it into a societal context. Now, that requires a lot of manipulation and alignment between the value that the technology has and the true needs, the true requirements of a particular society. So in this dance, if you like, design which is explorative, human-centered, and iterative really provides a way forward, because you're going backwards and forwards, stepping between the two worlds of science and society. So in the projects that we engage students with, we're already starting to bridge high science down into societal function and societal value. So I'm just kind of playing with Thomas's, anecdote about the alert system in Bangladesh. So you have these sensors that are giving you certain types of information. Now, what is that information, and who might benefit from the value that is created by interpreting that information in new ways? So I can imagine all sorts of partners that could benefit from better understanding the weather, that it might not just be about floods, it could be about agriculture, for example. So we're seeing different ways to use the same information. In design, we call that manipulating or being flexible with how you frame a problem. And what we challenge our students to do is to go beyond crisis management to kind of thinking, okay, how might your interventions, whether it be designing for an urban heat wave or designing for flood mitigation, how could that be actually bigger than crisis management? How could that be about building, strong social fabrics? These are the things that we need to do. Of course, we will still have high science that develops quantum computing and things like that in the future, and that the lead time on some of those technologies could be 30 or 40 years. But now I think even in the infancy of those technologies, we must make sure that we understand how that could benefit people who are vulnerable even now. So yes, it's the dance, as I like to say, or the dance, understanding the power of technology, but also really acknowledging the messiness and the complexity of social settings that needs to take place.
Thanks a lot for these comments. Of course, we hear a lot, and we know that cities are complex systems of systems, and sometimes it could be a little bit intimidating. But I think you put it in a really nice way, that really putting people in the center and looking at the applying design thinking and looking at what these systems, these complexities, how do they manifest themselves, and what is the emerging features of these systems. We don't have to understand every intricacies of every system to really understand what is happening on the ground, and finding solutions for that. I think this is really inspiring, and thanks a lot for those comments. So Hindun, coming back to you, I would like to ask you, building on your experience in Jakarta city, what would you advise to national societies of Red Cross, Red Crescent, who have over 160,000 units, in many of them are in cities as well, all over the world, and so they're important players. What would you advise these Red Cross, Red Crescent national societies, but also in general humanitarian actors, to strengthen their role and have a voice in solving the most pressing issues in urban areas that currently we are witnessing?
Yeah, thank you, Ainur. So I think if we come back to assessing what happens in the city, and then how is the crisis is actually impacting the urban people, I think what we saw recently in Jakarta is actually the emerging crisis of their access to basic needs. And then it can be quite a lot of access, even this access to food, because like with the whole of the economic crisis, it becomes a big issue even in the capital city like Jakarta, and access to clean water, to clean air, and I think so many others. And especially even there is quite a big issue on access to electricity, because like during the economic crisis, then it starts to become a complex issue when the governments actually want to is actually raising the electricity payment for the people itself, while actually they even have difficulties in getting their food in their daily life. So I think observing what is really the emerging issues that that put people in crisis to access to their daily basic needs. And then we also need to orient ourselves in the means that, okay, I think in these situations, clearly analyze like how do we actually want to bring people with us, because like we can also, by educating them, building them an awareness, and do quite a lot of campaigning also about what is really the most problematic sector or polluted sector that we all together need to ask the government to better regulate. Or I think so then we actually can also designing things whether people can also be part of the solutions, and how do actually also people can be part of the monitoring system. So I think that kind of things is also important, because like different issue can lead us to different way, and then how do we actually want to engage people and bring people with us. For example, in our air pollution campaign, so we are starting in the stage that people don't even realize that pollution's level can be measured by numbers. So that kind of baseline with a very poor knowledge on that situation. So what we provide at first is actually data that you actually can measure your air pollution's level and what does it mean to your health. Yeah. And then years later, it comes that quite a lot of initiative from the Jakartan people to have their own air pollution devices, and it connects to a platform. So it happens it happens individually, and then that kind of situations that put pressure to the governments to put their own monitoring levels, even though the standard is still very much debatable. But I think built up on that campaign, so we finally able to build a pressure that the government to then revising and strengthening their air pollution regulations for ambient, for air quality ambience. And now I think that kind of system, so then put people in the center of the monitoring system that can always speak to the government that this is what we have, and this is like really a real threat to us, because they can do their own monitoring. And then, as I mentioned before, they also run citizen lawsuits. So I think that there is a stage that we also need to understand, and since the very beginning, we also need to design where do we actually want to people to be part of the solutions or on the monitoring in the complex system in the city. So, for example, if we talk about the food crisis, and then something that is very much emerging this year because of the pandemic crisis and hit hard by the economic crisis, for example, in Jakarta. So then when we talk about the urban farmings, and then a very huge movements then engaging with many initiative communities, there is existing villages that we call kampung in Jakarta. That is very active in doing all these urban farming things. So, and they're also trying to be part of the solutions. And then how do we actually activating it? And I think that's I think that's so that I think there's so many things that we can do. There's so many ideas and there's so many creative. But then again, momentum is important to define which part that we actually want to intervene, and then doing a very proper observe and orientations before we actually need to bring people with us. Because then during my experience, the government will not move only by the voices of the NGOs or CSOs. Like you also need to bring people with you and people with a very high understanding and high knowledge that can also strengthening the pressure to the government.
Absolutely. Thank you. And what you said is a great segue to the question I was thinking of asking Thomas, actually. It's just, I really like the way you put it, that people should have this monitoring role, and they do, right? I mean, it's really an important part. It's their life in the end, and they should be. But that requires, in my mind, access to data, to information, and reliable, accurate information. And we know that governments or local governments are collecting a lot of information, but that's not always easily accessible or understandable, usable to the communities. And as Red Cross, we collect a lot of data at the community level, and that doesn't also get connected to the city or higher level. So we realize that there's a huge disconnect between all these levels. And yeah, I would like to ask you, Thomas, like as a government representative, how do you see these disconnects between government, local government, communities in terms of data, owning the data and information, so that people can be agents of change themselves?
Well, thank you. I will start with something else, which is the COVID crisis. I think the COVID crisis for us was, and I think for all of us in every walks of life, it will be a transforming experience. A lot of things will not be the same afterwards. And I think we can already draw a couple of lessons from the humanitarian side, what has happened the last few months in the humanitarian world. I think what we learned in the first weeks was how vulnerable we are with international staff to upkeep operations because of travel restrictions. It was incredibly complicated just to keep the UN logistics system floating. We invested a lot of money in that, and we became clear. But I think the much more important lesson from that experience was not we can make it with international, but that we realized how much actually local actors can do. I think most of the immediate response in most of the crises were locals. It was the country-based pool funds that were doing the job in the Sahel and in Asia, and you name it. So I think if we need another proof that localization is actually important, crucial, and is working, I think we learned it during this lesson of the first weeks of COVID. And I think there's no place where you actually can go better on localization in urban context. And I think Indun gave a couple of examples, Rebecca already. I think, but it is working particularly well in the urban context. Why? Because we can work in a different way. Because there's a lot out there. There are actors out there that can do a lot. Actually, also the government can do a lot in urban contexts. There are often safety nets that can be used. So not necessarily everything has to be done by humanitarian actors, because there's a lot of willingness and readiness of governments and local organizations to do the job. So what we need to do is a completely different way of working. It is no way necessary that humanitarian actors, particularly international humanitarian actors, have to replace local activity. But what we need is what we would call a Nexus Approach. I think we have to get all these people together, humanitarians, international, locals, governments, and development partners, and really think together how we can solve that. Not by replacing local activity, but to complement them from the international side. And let's take the example of Beirut. We will have a serious problem of poverty and almost famine not only amongst Syrian refugees and Palestinians, but also among Lebanese. But there's a functioning safety net for Lebanese. And we should invest there and not in the humanitarian assistance. And that's what the development side is doing. But there will still be things that the government cannot do. And that we have to complement. For instance, people that fall through the cracks, like illegal migrants, groups that are particularly weak and vulnerable, where the capacity of states authorities are not enough. And to figure that out, I think we need a completely different way of talking to each other. And I think the urban context is one where we can really do that. And that brings me to data. I think it's not so much about sharing data. I think it's about sharing ideas. And I think if we really think collectively, what is the objective that we want to achieve together? I think the sharing of data is immediately not a problem. I think it is really determining what we want to do, define it, and then discuss it. And then I think a lot will flow quite naturally, particularly in the urban context, because really we can work there through local actors, we can work through governments, and they're willing to do their job. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much for your comments. I really like the sharing ideas that you put out. And with that, I would like to turn to Rebecca again. And Rebecca, if taking this idea forward, sharing ideas, and how did you, in your the project that you talked about and applying human-centered design, what kind of stakeholders that you reached out, who was involved in all of these developing solutions? Like in urban areas, there's so many different actors and stakeholders. So how did you decide who to work with? How did you bring them together and create a shared idea using Thomas's word? Can you tell us a little bit about the process?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a wonderful question, and it's kind of delves into the magic, I think, of design. Before I said, it's human-centered, iterative. So we do things, we try them out, we test them, we learn. And over time, we actually start to establish shared goals between certain stakeholders. Now, at the beginning of a design project, we have a problem that we begin with. In this case, we began with the problem of urban heat waves and quite a significant increase in mortality rates that is seen during urban heat waves. Even in Western Europe, and how the changing climate was making these more frequent and more severe. So we started with the Netherlands Red Cross and our students and our researchers, and then it was about mapping out who is vulnerable and why. So we're looking, of course, at citizens and the nature of that vulnerability. And who takes care of them? And then you start to already expand and build a little ecosystem. So, of course, you have health practitioners that you want to involve. You have friends and family that you want to involve. Again, you ask yourself, who is looking after these vulnerable people? Then you're starting to look at local municipalities, urban planners, city developers. And all of a sudden, you start building this ecosystem of people that are interested in improving the livability of a city. Now, the trick is to get them around a table and actually have a conversation about improving the livability of cities. And that's where you can start to play with design as a co-creational tool or technique. So what you would be wanting to do is ask people, what is a livable, healthy city? What does that look like to you? And you'd be actually asking the various stakeholders to tell you about that and hopefully to start visualizing that. Now, in their various answers, you can start to synthesize shared principles, shared qualities that you can start to play with. And as a designer, what you are tasked with doing is doing that synthesis, coming back to those stakeholders and reporting that synthesis through possible ideas, possible ways forward. That's when you can enter your prototyping phase where you start to build, you start to test, you start to learn, and you start creating that feedback mechanism back to all of those stakeholders you've built in your ecosystem. Of course, now you have a lot of momentum, right? So you're gathering momentum and you're starting to prepare or you're starting to kind of ready the ecosystem for the possibility of implementing an idea. And that is a whole new ball game, and that is proving to be very difficult. Organizations are kind of stuck in this, well, I don't own that problem, so I'm not going to fix it type of thinking. So yeah, and also because many people own this problem, it's not sure who should be really the full funding partner in terms of implementing. So I think what we've seen is that at the center of this problem of livability of cities and urban heatwaves in particular is a communication problem between these various stakeholders about why they're vulnerable, and how they need help, and how urban heatwaves are dangerous. So I've told you a little bit about the process of design, and of course the best way to know design is to experience it. And so what we try to do is just bring stakeholders in and work with them hands-on. We've been doing this with the Red Cross now, the Netherlands Red Cross, for 2 years now. So this is our second project with them. We've already done a project with them on St. Martin, the island in the Caribbean, in the aftermath of Hurricane Irma, for example. So we're taking them as a partner, we're holding their hand, and we're going through the design process together. So I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, excellently. Thank you so much. And I see Hindun nodding quite a lot. So I'm assuming you have gone through a similar process, and for a successful campaign, it has to be really resonate with people and own and design with people. So can you tell us a little bit from that perspective, your experience, and also did you have any policy change as a result of that, like taking it a little bit different level?
Yes, thank you. I agree with that. Yeah, sorry, Rebecca. Okay, yeah, I agree that if we actually decided to intervene or bring one issue up in our, for example, in campaigning, so we actually also need to address the criteria of urgency and importance. So that's how we actually also try to build a very strong link how then this issue also need to resonate to people, as you mentioned before. And then I think another thing that is also quite important is actually on that process, we also need to analyze like which part of communities or which part of city audiences that we actually want to bring together with us, that we actually want to engage. So I think that kind of process of thinking is also need to build up. For example, if you talk about air pollution, so because if, for example, because I came from Greenpeace, so sometimes our audiences is very much in touch with the more into the activism group. But then again, we know that the most vulnerable groups from the pollution issue is actually women, children, elderly. So I think we actually need to approach totally different groups, which actually they have a very big mass, but they're existingly not linked with actually some organizations that are very much active on the ground. So I think that kind of engagement strategy and being very much clear into which type of audiences that we actually want to strongly engage, and then activating them, as I mentioned before, whether we actually want to activate them as also being part of the solutions with their whole initiative, or they can also be part of the monitoring system. So I think that kind of designing the strategy is also important. And then when we actually targeting an actors, it is also important that what we experience is a different group of audience sometimes feel that they don't convenience to directly attack the governments, for example, or directly attack polluted sectors or companies. So it differs from how I usually did with organizations like Greenpeace, where like when you actually want to just give a battle and then boycotting them, for example. So I think that kind of how to say it, like try to finding a way and how can people also activating and do at their convenience and their capability and voicing out their concerns that actually goes to the right actors that we want. So for example, when we try when we did our air pollution campaign, so it's not only the Jakarta governor that we ask for a change to strengthening, for example, the air quality standard, because we know that the governor is very much popular. So whatever that are attacking this government, so sometimes people are just rejected. So we also need to bring many other actors or many other targets that strongly related, that people is actually more convenient in campaigning or voicing their concerns on that. So like, for example, the national governments, or for example, the industrial sectors, that they're very much feel convenience in drawing their concerns to them rather than to their own governance. So I think that kind of political understanding also very much important. And how do we actually, once we bring people with us, it is also important to like what kind of approach that we use, what kind of communications that we use, and then what is the convenience level at their capability that they can do to actually succeed at the demand that we actually call for that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Absolutely, you really touched upon very, very important points. Since I'm checking the time and the questions, but I see that we have about 9-10 minutes, and since some of you really mentioned how the COVID is changing things, and I guess we are all experiencing it. So I would like to ask you, how do you see the future of humanitarian action in urban context after COVID? Because this whole, like Thomas, you said that it gave a new meaning to localization agenda, which made it so real. It's just really happening at the local level. So maybe starting with you, Thomas, like, how do you see the future of humanitarian action in urban contexts after COVID?
Yeah, I think we're very much preoccupied by COVID, rightly so, but I think it will be a blip at the end compared to what is at stake out there with climate change. I think what we'll see, we have two drivers now in the humanitarian system, which is conflict and natural disasters. They amount for 80 and 20% of the total amount of needs, and they're now at 40 billion. 5 years ago, we had 6 billion. I mean, that's just at the beginning. And now we have a third driver, which is climate change, which is compounding the other two. And that makes it so complicated. And that will be the challenge starting very quickly. Just to show you what is ahead of us is the Sahel. I mean, we had a humanitarian conference just a few days ago in a humanitarian conference on Sahel, which Germany co-chaired, where we tried to find money. But we also talked about the origin of the crisis in the Sahel, and it is one bleak picture. We all thought immediately about climate change, and we come back to again and again. And Mark Lowcock made an excellent speech a couple of days before at the Sorbonne University on Sahel. I can only recommend everybody to read this paper. And he clearly lines out for the Sahel only that it will be the region with the highest increase in temperature in the next few decades, and it will have devastating effects. And he says it's at a tipping point, and that's true. It's critical, and it's a tipping point, but it's not a point of no return. And I think what he says, he gives a lot of proposals what we have to do now in a holistic way to address the Sahel. And now you can say East South Asia is the same, with different ingredients, but the same challenge. But what he comes back to the same issue, which is finding urban solutions. I think we think in terms of climate change way too much in rural phenomenon. It starts rural, it ends automatic in the urban context for two reasons. First of all, because people just go there because there's no way to go. So we have to solve more and more issues that originate outside urban context, inside urban context. And so we have to have this kind of changing gear in the humanitarian system from a basically rural context into an urban context. And I think we have learned a lot in the past few years, especially around the Syria crisis. I think we learned a lot how to accommodate refugees in Amman, in Beirut, in Istanbul, and we can work on that. The second issue is there's a vulnerability of the urban context as such. I mean, it is also at risk of climate change, and I think we have to do work much more of getting now the urban context ready for climate change in terms of improving reducing vulnerability, getting our risk mitigation right, and getting ready for early response in this context. So for me and for Germany, but my ministry, I think we have three conclusions. What we want to do beyond COVID. Now, it's true we have to get through COVID first, but the first thing is, again, as I said, I think we will continue to have the refugee camp somewhere in the middle of nowhere, close to a crisis, but we will have to do more and more in urban context, and I think we have to finance much more in the system so that they can accommodate that, and that requires a lot of innovation, new thinking. The second one I've already mentioned before, the urban context is extremely complex, but it's extremely interesting to work in because there's so many actors, and we really have to get along with the Nexus and working through and with local authorities and local actors. And the final one is, as I said, let's in the future look at how we can make the urban context ready for climate change. That's basically where we want to go. It's going to be a big challenge, but I think if any group can do it, it's the Humanitarian. So I remain optimistic that we can adjust.
Well, thank you for sharing these really thoughtful insights and hopeful as well. Since you mentioned displacement migration, really these people are moving into cities as we are observing. Maybe Rebecca, I want to ask you about this kind of context where you might have quite a lot of different people suddenly find themselves in the same geographical space, but then it brings a lot about the social cohesion, inclusive community concepts that as Red Crescent, we are really putting a lot of effort in creating these and increasing creating inclusive communities and increasing social cohesion. I wonder how human-centered design and the process you described can help building this kind of social cohesion. Can you share maybe a few thoughts with us?
Of course, yeah, and I can pick up on your earlier question regarding, how can we learn from COVID? And I think part of the solution is very much, and I think one of the legacies of COVID as a crisis is that we've seen how fast we can adapt when we actually allow a conversation between policymakers, lawmakers, and of course citizens and local businesses, and then really the ecosystem, how fast we can adapt to these circumstances when we together put our minds to it. But what we need is some tools, some methodologies, some techniques to have that shared conversation. Now, design can assist with this. In hearing various stories from various stakeholders, I think one of the critical things we have to do in design is find the unheard voices. Who is protected wrongfully from being heard, and can we hear from them, and can we reveal their stories and learn from their stories? And I think that might be something to do with this question around if forced migration into urban context, a lot of the people that are cramming into cities, we don't see them, we don't hear them. And they are terribly vulnerable, and perhaps even the most vulnerable. So I think I believe that our approach to humanitarian delivery or aid delivery must be much more conversational between the organizations delivering the aid, the cities, municipalities, and the citizens themselves. And we need to have ways to hear voices of the vulnerable, but also the unheard, unseen. Can we find them to understand their circumstances? And I think design can play a role in this, certainly. We're very positive based on our relationship with the Netherlands Red Cross on this topic.
Excellent. Thank you. Very, very good to hear that. Absolutely. We have a few more minutes, and I want to go back to Hindun and ask you, I wonder how COVID will change this activism and campaigning. What's your insights on that? Can you share?
Yeah, I agree that it changed a lot. What we find from emerging crisis during COVID is something that is especially related more with the economic crisis. So then the more growing urban poor that live in a very densely populated area, that then again, they are more risk to get the COVID infections as well. And then they also have a very minimum access to health. Especially if it becomes more and more expensive. So I think the way it changed our work is actually now we are prioritizing more into building a movement of solidarity, because then I mean the way you survive the economy, or the way you survive the crisis during these situations, actually when you're actually helping each other. So I think that kind of messaging, or that kind of campaigning that we always try to bring forward. So it's no longer about how to say it, like specifying ourselves into a very problematic issues or sector and try to change the system itself. Well, actually it can happen parallelly, but in the way we're surviving the crisis, then everybody need to hand in hand to be together. And that's something that cannot only be delivered by the governments or by any organizations that want to intervene in the crisis, but then this Solidarity Act is something that how do we actually also will be able to rebuild the economy. And I think the second thing that we are now prioritizing is also about building resiliency. So if you talk about building resiliency, we are concentrating into two things, which is food and energy. So I think those two things, that whatever these two access is actually try also to help them survive when you actually facing the economic crisis in Indonesia, which with a lot of uncertainties, and nobody knows whether we will have a bounce back of our economy at least until end of this year or next year. So that kind of resiliency context, and then put quite a lot of trainings to communities, especially for urban farming, for clean energy. So hopefully it will actually help the communities to survive. And then if we talk about a bigger narrative of challenging the business as usual economic development that are very much centralized. So actually activating people and make them being more independent in the context of surviving the crisis, that actually will help them to also build a very circular economy in their villages or in the kampung or in the communities. So I think those two things, that they change a lot our ways of working as a campaigning organizations as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think it's a great way to wrap up our panel, calling for solidarity. I think that's exactly what we need at all levels, and not just dealing with tackling the pandemic, but climate change and all the other disasters. That we really require solidarity at the community level, but not just community level. We all the way vertically, local governments, community, NGOs, governments, we all have to work together. That's absolutely an essential thing. So we are already past the hour, and I'm checking if there are any questions from our audience. And I want to give another chance to audience to ask any questions, but if not, I would like to thank you so much for sharing your insights and experiences. Really, really interesting ideas and vision I heard, and I hope everybody feels the same. With that, thank you so much. And we are, I think, ending the panel right now. Thanks, and good evening, good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Ainur. Thank you, everybody.
My pleasure.